You're listening to Arsenal Pass, a flesh and blood podcast for players by players. And all about strategy, leveling up, and the latest news in the world of Wraith. Welcome to Arsenal Pass.
Welcome back to episode 119 of Arsenal Pass. Hayden Dow here with the one, Brendan Patrick. Brendan, you're going to be playing Nationals this year. I want to know, how's your testing for Nationals going?
Well, I just found out I was playing, so it's not going great. But I have found some people to test with. I think the group, I don't know. I don't know why I don't feel comfortable like saying the ninja. It's probably fine. But I feel like with my group, it's a little bit dangerous. You know, like a few of these players have an affinity towards a certain hero that's a bit spicy. And, you know, when you get a lot of those people in a room together, it tends to not go great. Yeah, they really do cook. They cook. But yeah, Hayden, honestly, the marquee event of my past week or so has been, I'm starting to get over that sickness. I was very sick. It was bad. It really sucked, man. I don't know what happened, but you know, I had like a sinus infection, went to like kind of a chest infection or whatever, but man, just mentally, it made me feel so off and so foggy. I think it was just because all the congestion in my head, but it sucked, dude. Oof.
Well, glad to see Brendan Patrick back to 90% of Brendan Patrick.
Yeah.
This is interesting. You're just talking about you playing Nationals. This will be like the first big event that we haven't tested together, or like, because we're not playing it together as well. So it's going to be like an interesting, I mean, I'm sure we'll still converse and talk, but it's, you know, all the Pro Tours that we've both played in, all the callings that we've both played in.
Well, we still have Worlds. We still have Worlds.
We still have Worlds. We'll always have Barcelona.
Yeah, we still have Worlds. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know. I don't exactly know how I'm going to take it yet. If I'm going to try to take it a bit more casual and play something that I genuinely enjoy, or I might end up on the Spike deck. I think I will avoid, like, if Lexi is the best deck, which I'm not saying it is by any means, but just snapshot of last meta, let's say we fast forward, I probably would avoid playing that deck, to be honest. I also think that, you know, when possible, I end up on the deck that beats the deck rather than the deck. I only end up on the deck if it is overwhelmingly the best deck.
Yeah, I mean, that's always been our philosophy, I think. Yeah. I am trying my darndest to avoid playing Lexi. I mean, this week in Flesh and Blood, getting into some Nationals testing, really trying to get nice nose to the grindstone. Dusk Till Dawn is out now, and trying to learn as much about what this format could look like, you know, kind of putting the limited to the side a little bit with Monarch and really starting to focus on class constructed. Played a bit of, you know, I played a bit of everything, honestly, this week. Had a look at Leviah, gone back to Icelander for like Viscerai, nice. You know, Lexi, of course. Like, it's just everything in an attempt to work out, you know, what I think is powerful. And this format looks like it. I mean, we're about to see Battle Hardened Cincinnati. Well, actually, by the time this pod releases, because we're recording early, Brendan, it would have already happened. We've got the calling coming up next weekend. By the time this releases, it's going to be really interesting to see what the early meta shakes out look like, because, you know, we say this often, I know, things look open, but this really does look open. We've had Ultim Living Legend. Lexi is like, yes, I still think the deck to beat, but there are other things out there. So yeah, it's been an interesting start to testing process.
I'm very excited to see, you know, with this upcoming Battle Hardened, like you said, it'll be over by the time this is out, but I'm excited to see the decks that come from that. I mean, Dusk Till Dawn is very much a set where I very much appreciate somebody else building the initial decks for me, and then I'll go from there, because it is deep. It is a mind bender, especially when you're looking at Prism and, you know, even Leviah to an extent. Like, it's like, how am I going to break this? Because it seems like it can be broken, you know? I don't know.
Yeah. Bolton, you know, maybe
not that
maybe
one.
Not. Vincent, that's a real,
Vincent's
that's
the
a
real
puzzle.
one. Vincent's the for one where I don't even, I just like, I don't even know where to go with it. Like, is it even worth it? Do I just let somebody else get the framework and then we can go from there with Vincent? Because that is the real thinker.
Well, this is episode 119 of Arsenal Pass. The main topic of the pod, we are talking to senior game designer for Flesh and Blood, Bryan Gotlieb, who made it, it's a bit of a spoiler for the interview, but not really. He made it pretty abundantly clear he wasn't going to talk to us about Vincent and you know, the gameplay sort of, maybe the fundamentals behind what they thought for Vincent, because he wants players to work it out themselves. I think that kind of says maybe all you need to know about the puzzle that Vincent will be in this format.
Yeah, I do have to say there is a very special little nugget in this talk we have with him, so please get through it. And if you have any interest in where the future of Flesh and Blood design is going and how it will impact you as a casual player or a competitive player, you better listen to the whole thing, because he drops an absolute bomb.
Yeah, just conveniently right at the end of the interview as well.
Well, you can't tell him where it is.
Well, it's close. That's close to the end of the interview. It's a great interview. So that is the main topic of the pod. We are talking Flesh and Blood design. We throw a lot of, well, Brendan in particular throws a lot of hardball questions at Bryan when it comes to the design of Dusk Till Dawn, of, the future of Flesh and Blood. There's a lot of nuggets in there as well. If you're particular heroes of where you may want to look for building these for the new class constructed the format, as well as Bryan does talk about, all the heroes in Dusk Till Dawn, as well as other heroes and kind of fundamentals and philosophy behind Flesh and Blood. I guess, Brendan, we are recording early, so nothing really to share in the news. Of course, we did talk about the announcement of Worlds in Barcelona. We're both definitely going to be there, so look forward to seeing players there. I don't know, anything else that we need to make sure we cover before we get into the main topic of the pod? No Command and Cookout question this week, Brendan, but if you do want to get them in, you can drop them in the YouTube comments below. We have had a couple in the past 2 weeks. There was some in the last episode, a couple of great questions, but if you do want to get your question, drop them in the YouTube comments below. You can tweet at us, you can email us at arsenalpassfab@gmail.com, or if you're a Arsenal Pass patron, you can drop it in the Patreon Discord as well.
Mm-hmm. Nothing else from me. It's a long interview, but like I said, it's packed with value. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. And for the main topic of the pod, we're joined by the man, the myth, the legend, Bryan Gotlieb. Bryan, thank you so much for coming back on the podcast. Very happy to have you. Can I just lead in? You're living in Auckland right now. Is that correct?
Yeah, I am in Auckland right now. I don't know how to quantify it as whether I'm living here or not. I'm just in an Airbnb, and I'm in a very strange Airbnb, which is why you don't see my shining face and why things maybe sound a little warehousey. That's kind of the only way I can describe where I'm presently staying.
Yeah.
I'm here now.
Is it sort of your next step in working with LSS? You're now splitting time between Auckland and the US?
Yeah, I mean, it's already very close to that. I basically am slightly less than a 50-50 split, but just trying to set things up where it's easier and easier to spend more time here. And I come down now and I stay in Airbnbs, which it's fine. And, you make it work, but I'm looking to get something a little bit more permanent here, given how much time I spend here and how often I go back and forth.
Yeah, and for the people that don't know, what is your role at LSS? I think people sort of...
That's a good question. Yeah, I don't know.
I think we know the high level of game design, but is there anything past that, anything deeper, and what parts of design? Because I know there's different levels, right? There's the people that are game testing and the people that actually develop the cards. What do you do?
Yeah, so I was doing an interview with Polygon the other day, and I just had to go to James. I'm like, I have to tell them something. Like, what am I? I don't really know what I am, and it doesn't matter. Like, I just come and I do my work, and I don't care what my job title is. But we settled on, I think, senior game designer. So that is my official title now with LSS, kind of, sort of. And I work on a lot of the aspects of design and development. I'm involved in the early process, some of the making something from nothing and rounding out the ideas. And then I'm involved in the late process too, balancing user experience, making sure environments are fun, balanced, all those things. I'm involved in format health discussions, involved in format changes, all that kind of stuff. Anything that touches specifically playing the game. The stuff I don't really have a lot to do is with, although, I'm occasionally asked for feedback, is OP structure and, event booking, things like that. That's pretty far. Operations. Yeah. All that stuff is.
I've heard you get asked the questions anyway.
I do. I get a lot of the questions, which is fine. I get it. I have a larger social media presence than a lot of the folks at LSS. And so the questions are by default going to come to me. But I had to tell people I'm just not the right person to answer those questions. There's way better people to point them to. And there is a contact site on the LSS website. So you should, if you have questions, go find those folks and they'll give you better answers than I will.
Yeah, so can you talk a little bit about the progression of you working with LSS? I know you initially came on as a contractor, I believe, working in design, but I mean, that was maybe a year plus ago. I just remember when we first had you on the podcast was the Bryan Gotlieb was tweeting all these pictures of Gauntlet decks that you had set up and you were playing the game. You were very excited about it, but now it seems like you're quite deep. How did you sort of get in touch with LSS and then progress to the role that you're in right now?
Yeah, mostly just shit posting on Twitter and just being loud.
That works.
And obnoxious.
Okay.
Yeah, it does occasionally. But James just reached out to me, and we got to talking, found a lot of commonality and a lot of respect for each other, and just started collaborating on things. And like you said, first time was with Dynasty, and I was just brought in as kind of like a late stage contractor to review some things and give some input on things that were not quite working all that well. And things went well through that process. Our ideas gelled very quickly. A lot of that became metastasized into Arachne, which I mean, I guess if you like wanted to be critical of someone's first design foray, I could understand why you would be critical of Arachne. But I'm really proud of that hero, and it's going to do more in the future as we see like heroes scale up over time. And I think the theming, the vibes, like how the assassin class actually works, all that stuff is a big hit, even if Arachne is not a particularly strong hero in the metagame. So things like grew from there. You know, we worked successfully on Dynasty, and after that, I made my first trip down to Auckland to work in person on Outsiders, and that I was involved with from the beginning, and just kind of sculpting together with James the broad limited environment, and then working with Dev to get everything over the line. And now it's just become a constant. I am deeply involved in all parts of design and development, and I love it, man. It's honestly my dream job.
Yeah, so I know when people come into a game studio like LSS, they often will not be working on sort of the next set that comes into consumers' hands, or even sets that maybe, you know, some of the players are familiar with. What sets did you feel like you had the biggest impact on immediately? Like, what set is the Brian Gottlieb set so far? Like,
it's definitely Outsiders so far. Yeah, that's the one where I was involved like from the beginning, and all aspects of that. That was ground out with just like me and James sitting in his home and figuring out how we wanted to do this new kind of take on limited, and getting all the theming right, and the bones of it, and just playing games against each other till we had a really functional set, a really exciting set. And then obviously it's the dev team and the art team and everyone involved in LSS who brings it over the finish line. But that's the one where I was really in it from the beginning, and you know, I feel like a very large attachment to that set. It feels to me like my first set, for sure.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to a question, actually, Brian. Are sets, from LSS's perspective, are they worked on sequentially? This is a question I've always had about how you look at game design, especially in the TCG. Are you working on sets sequentially as they would be released, or...?
It depends. It does depend. Like there's stuff that is in the tank for the future that is kind of out of order. There's stuff that is being worked on sequentially. So it really just depends on what makes sense. A lot of where like inspiration takes you, right? Like if you have an idea, sometimes you just need to chase that idea down. You can't get it out of your head, and things will work that way sometimes, especially in the early design fronts. Like that's very much how things go. And then, you know, when you get to like development work, it's a little bit more time-based, structural, because obviously you have publication deadlines and things you want to get released in a certain order. So that's when the schedule tightens up a bit.
Can you sort of explain to me, like, I'm, you know, a 5-year-old, what the difference is exactly between design and development? Because I noticed that you sort of partition them into two separate things right there.
Yeah, so it's I'll say this, it's looser in LSS than I think some other places, because our dev team is very active in design. Our design team is very active in development. Like there is a good back and forth that happen between the two. But the way I conceptualize it is that design is there to present the idea, to tell you, you know, here is a hero that is stealthy, and the mechanic is the card comes face down and they can swap it with another card, and they lean on this dagger to soften defenses, and they're supposed to play a very mid-range style, and here's these support cards. And then you go to dev and you go, make this into something real, like make this work, make this balanced, make it make sense under the rules, make it contextually fun to play, make it a hero that is falling at a point on the spectrum that we're comfortable with as far as power level. Like all that fine tuning really comes from the dev side.
Awesome. Well, I want to ask you, speaking of limited sets, I want to ask you about a sort of new limited set, but an old new limited set in Monarch. Have you had any experience personally drafting Monarch?
I drafted Monarch once.
Okay.
And it was at LSS. It was literally like we just went back and did some Monarch, and you know, kind of for funsies. And Monarch is after the time I started. Like you guys know, I was finding the game right at the tail end of Monarch. I was only engaging with Constructed at that point, and then it was Tales of Aria limited season, and that's where I really dove into the limited side of things. So I'm doing catch-up work on Monarch limited right now. I very much need to still learn the format, and When I say doing catch-up work, I mean I have absolutely no time to do catch-up work. But at some point before Nationals, I will have to find a place to do that.
Yeah, I would really like specifically. Maybe we're not there yet in terms of how much you've engaged with the format, but I would like to hear sort of your thoughts on Monarch as a competitively viable limited format. Comparing it to something like Outsiders, a format that you worked on a lot that was very, very well received, especially from the competitive community. Do you think that you have enough knowledge around Monarch to sort of compare them in a competitive setting? Do you think Monarch will hold up at that Nationals level to provide an experience that's as robust as we got in something like Outsiders?
I do think it holds up, and in part because there's a lot of depth there. There's a lot of really intricate drafting decisions that hold up Monarch. And when you get to the gameplay, it can be a swingier experience, I think. It's not so much grinding out value as it was in Outsiders and playing these really tight games over and over. There are games you just get blown out of the water. There's sizing mismatches in a lot of ways. There's just the whole Spectra into Levia setup, which has always been Phantasm into Levia setup, which has always been very weird to me. Like, it's just a strange thing to kind of make the basis of your set. But ultimately, it leads to a really, really interesting draft environment. And then, again, those highs of the games, like the best games you play in Monarch, they're really, really good. And I think there's a higher number of non-games, but that ceiling is still right there where you can play incredible, incredible games of Limited.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Yeah, I think in Monarch, it's interesting, going back to a set where you can stay so open in generics and, the Monarch equipment being so powerful, starts in play, stays in play. But then you have this dichotomy between the light and the shadow heroes. But also when you take into this meta aspect of the format, which is, a general player based proclivity towards the light heroes, and especially something like Prism. It adds a really interesting.
That holds now. Like, I think that was very true when we first got to Monarch. I wonder if that has loosened up a bit. Like, that's kind of what I'm starting to see.
I do think it is loosening up, and I do think I think that will definitely be the case by the time we get to Nationals. That being said, playing War of the Monarch this weekend, and it could be region based, right? I did notice that in my pods, and just generally, there's probably 3 pods running around me. There was an affinity towards Prism. There was also an affinity towards Chain, actually, as well, because I think a lot of people have heard about the power level of Chain, even though it was in constructed. Chain is sort of this mythical hero of Flesh and Blood at this point that not a lot of people get to play. So, I mean, my pod has specifically had about 3 Chains in it and 3 Prisms. I still think people look at Prism as like the easiest floor of the format, right? Like, that is one of the safer decks. So yeah, I don't know. I bring it back to an example of a calling, a high level competitive calling that Hayden actually played in, where, it was 6 light heroes and 2 shadow heroes, with the finals being split between Matt Rogers and Kiki, both on Levia and Chain respectively. So a very, very interesting format. I know the pack collation was a bit interesting back then, I think. Maybe
I think what happens there is, like, there's this huge skill gap that has closed in Flesh and Blood as well. Like, the player base is just so much better. And that's not to take anything away from players who are participating early on in that scene. Many of them have very much proven themselves to be among the best players, but they've been joined by a lot of other really, really dangerous Flesh and Blood players. And I think the skill cap on putting together a great Levia deck, a great Chain deck, it's just higher. And then piloting those decks is another step. Like, you have to be able to pilot them efficiently as well. And I will tell you, I've played Monarch Limited once. I drafted Prism because I was like, I just don't know how to do this yet. Like, I need to get more experience under my belt before I feel comfortable playing Chain, playing Levia. And I think a lot of people at War of the Monarch very much doing the same thing. But when we get to Nationals, all bets are off as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, you're so right. I think it's about the level of where these drafts are happening, and people getting used to it as well. The Shadow Heroes are harder to draft. They're harder to play. It just is fact. I think anecdotally, the sort of dozen or so drafts I've done locally, I haven't drafted Prism yet. Oh, I drafted Prism once, and it really depends, because I like to stay open in this format, and there are people who prefer to play Prism, which is fine, and I think but once you get to a level like Nationals, like you say, Brian, I think you'll see people come with their strategies. They'll be looking to exploit open Levia seats, open Chain seats, etc., and make the most of it.
I want to ask you both. I want to sort of put a question out there for you both, but I feel like as Flesh and Blood has started to mature, and we've experienced these very competitive limited sets, both as a result of the design, but also the growing player base, the growing experience in the player base. I feel like the standard of having a 30 card deck has become less popular. Obviously, it's more format dependent in some formats rather than others. But do you think that as we progress in limited, we keep playing limited into the future, do you think it'll be less and less correct deck to actually play those 30 cards. I've just found that, it seems like in Outsiders, it was almost objectively correct to, often play above that. Maybe if you're playing a hyper synergistic deck like an Azalea deck, you wouldn't. But it seems like nowadays everybody's kind of going for that 32, 33, 34. And my real follow-up question is like, what is the actual correct amount of cards to put in a Flesh and Blood limited deck?
Yeah, I just think there's no hard answer to that question, right? Like that's kind of one of the cool things about Flesh and Blood, and one of the things that has been part of my learning journey with Flesh and Blood. Like I came from Magic, I saw people with larger, honestly, both CC and limited decks, like above 60 cards or above 30 cards. I was like, oh, these idiots have no idea what they're doing. Then as I play more, I'm like, oh, I was the idiot here, actually. Like there is a lot of validity to managing fatigue well, playing with a larger deck size, but it's all contextual. Like it's so dependent on hero. It's so dependent on what your hero's goals are for a particular matchup. It depends on the depth of the card pool in the format you're playing. Like, are you forced to play weaker cards to hit that 33, 34 card threshold, or are you keeping your card power really high? All those things come into play all the time. And I think the range of acceptable deck sizes in Flesh and Blood is something that is very, very interesting to me and is a good part of strategic engagement. And I think you actually saw that reflected with recent Blitz changes, honestly, like and desire to kind of preserve some of that flexibility. Those are all, I'm sure we'll talk more about that as we go through the pod. Those are all very experimental at this point, and I don't know what ultimately is going to stick, but that's where a lot of that desire came from, is just opening up the ability to be expressive with your play and look for edges everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hayden, do you have anything to touch on there? I mean, tell me if I'm wildly off base with, because I know in Outsiders is definitely a thing, but even as I come back to Monarch, it seems like I'm like, oh, I much less consider playing 30 cards like I did back when Monarch was originally released, where I think you and I were both like, went to a lot of pre-releases, we played a lot of limited, and we saw a lot of Prism players try to jam a bunch of cards on their deck and fatigue Shadow Heroes, and it was really bad. But nowadays, my Bolton deck, and it's going to have that 33, 34 cards, because if they're good enough that they meet my curve and not playing objectively terrible cards that block for like nothing, then it seems correct most of the time.
Yeah, I think it's something that we've learned through. We've gone through these different types of limited formats, 4 hero formats with lower defensive value, formats with 14 card packs. You have less playables to do this with. Maybe you are trying to go above 30, but you might not have the card quality. It comes back. I think Brian said it pretty eloquently, and I completely agree. And I think the kind of backing to it is this philosophical approach to how you think about Flesh and Blood. And it's also meta dependent, and even limited formats have metas. The way that people might approach Monarch last time to the way they approach now. In fact, it's just different. People weren't thinking about card quality and card economy and the use of their cards the same way that they are now, and so that changes the way the format looks like. I don't think there's an answer to that question about how many cards is correct. I think more and more, though, playing above 30 cards is subjectively going to be correct to a lot of players depending on the formats they're playing. So it's a really interesting question. I think it'll continue to develop, and it's not just limited, it's also constructed as well. And it really comes down to the philosophy of all the things around the particular game that you're about to play, from the person sitting across from you, from the hero you have, to the draft that just happened.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of philosophy, Brian, I want to ask you about ban philosophy. And with the most recent changes, how close were you to potentially no changes?
Very close. I mean, we said that in the announcement. I think the decision was very close. And that's not to say that we don't believe that Lexi was the best deck pre-changes. Like we were pretty much of that opinion. It was clear, but the data showed us that the margins were acceptable. It was a best deck that was leading to an interesting metagame. It was a best deck that was about to have a real wrench thrown in its plans. And, the ascension of Ultim to Living Legend is, again, one of those just foundational shifts in Flesh and Blood metagames. It changes absolutely everything. What decks are viable. You look at some of the just most fearsome predators of Lexi in the old metagame. Azalea comes to mind. Azalea in the Ranger mirror was pretty good into Lexi, but had to just dramatically warp their builds to even have a prayer against Ultim. Then you have Azuri, who was just straight up good against Lexi. And, all of this is like contextual. Lexi could change. Lexi can build a lot of different ways. But Azuri very much beat up by Ultim. And then you get to Dromai, which, that's one of those 90-90 matchups. Everyone's favored. But I think there were some really good predators of Lexi that were being kept down by Ultim. And then you throw in the additional spanner in the works of just four. I want to say four new heroes because it honestly feels that way with both Bolton and Levia. It's just a very, very big change that was coming, and there was a lot of consideration to just doing nothing despite Lexi's power level.
Yeah, I was going to say, how do you feel about Lexi as sort of that litmus test deck, right? That deck that these, as we receive Dusk Till Dawn and start experimenting with it, Lexi is the question that all those heroes will have to sort of answer first. Not to say that they won't have bad matchups existing somewhere else in the metagame, maybe less represented, but did you feel comfortable with these new Dusk Till Dawn heroes being able to sort of make room for themselves in a meta potentially dominated by Lexi as Ultim rotated out?
Yeah, one of the things that we got very right going into this metagame internally was where we saw Lexi, and that was as probably the best deck. It's been something that has been on our radar for a very long time. It did not surprise us, and that is the format we were preparing for, testing for. One thing that did change was Oldham left a little bit sooner than we expected him to. It just kind of went on a tear and finally closed some events right in a row. So that was a little bit different than the internal environment we were looking at. But if anything, that seemed to be sort of another strike against Lexi rather than something empowering her. So, like I said, we were pretty prepared to go forward with DTD as it was. And I think we were very clear about that in the language of our ban announcement. Like, this was a borderline decision. We just wanted to make things, if not actually be a little bit more open, maybe feel a little bit more open. Like maybe let players know it's okay to experiment with these new heroes. You don't have to default to Lexi. You can look at your matchups again. And I think the Bullseye Bracers ban hopefully hits a sweet spot for doing that.
Yeah, I have a conspiracy that it's a secret Kano buff, and you're the inside man for Kano. Finally, giving us a chance of banning those Bullseye Bracers. I'm going
to let you guys in on a secret, this is something that I've never told anyone before. But the way we actually do ban and suspend announcements at LSS is I sit down and I decide if I personally hate you. And if I do, then I target your hero and I make sure it never has any success. And in the past, Brandon, I hated you. I didn't want you to have fun. And I took that out on Kano. But, we did Worlds together. We covered the finals. We kind of bonded a little bit. And I said, you know what, this guy, he deserves a break. I'm going to make this decision solely based on buffing Kano for Brendan and Patrick. And that's how we got to this point.
He has an olive branch in one hand and a dagger in the other with Shroud of Darkness also being printed in this hat. How dare you?
That's true assassin. He's a true assassin. But also, Brendan, how are you going to feel when your opponent flips Shock Charmers instead of Bullseye Bracers now?
It's not great, to be honest. It's not great. But we'll get into that.
It might be worse.
Yeah. Brian, was Ultim a troublesome hero to balance around? Was Ultim, do you think it was the deck was too powerful, and was it constricting design?
I think there were aspects of Ultim that were too powerful. I think the Crown of Seeds battle was a long one. There's a lot of things I love about Crown of Seeds. Crown of Seeds is one of my favorite cards to play with in Flesh and Blood. There's a lot of bad things I think it did to the metagame. And it's funny, going back to my Magic days, my possibly all-time favorite card in Magic is Sensei's Divining Top. That's a card that should never be legal. Never be legal in any format. I accept that. I understand that. But I really, really love playing with it. And I think a lot of people felt the way about Crown of Seeds. It was a very satisfying card to play, but it messed up a lot of stuff. And those old him decks were extremely challenging to give heroes tools to fight. But I don't think it did damage to the Flesh and Blood format. I think it was a good, hardy, powerful control deck that had ups and downs, but mostly put off some pretty positive matchups. And we had to take some interventive steps, I would say, along the way. Things like the Winter's Wail ban, or whatever other host of bans you want to look at. Those were important, but I hope people are now starting to see patterns with how we manage these things. And that's how we like to do these things. We like to just kind of tweak power levels and bring things down a little bit to try and make compelling metagames. We don't want people to feel like they've had their deck snatched out of their hands and they can never play it again. And now Lexi is facing the same thing. This is just generally how we approach our top decks in Flesh and Blood. And so Oldham had to go through that process, but I think it did it well. It was a fine portion of the metagame. I am not sad that it's gone, but it was acceptable, and we learned a lot from it, and we'll move on from there.
Can I ask a question then? I have two questions actually, Brian, off the back of that. One of them is in the lead up to it, people were talking about all the cards that could be hidden in Lexi. You know, people were, I don't know, I feel like every card within a Lexi playable deck got mentioned at some point. But were there other cards that were on the table for you rather than Bullseye Braces with the team? Were there other considerations, or was Bullseye Braces kind of always thought of?
No, we considered everything. Of course, we considered everything. Like, it would have been poor development and poor game balancing to just be like, we're banning this. We don't care about anything else. We thought very carefully about it. We considered every card that you have seen proposed. I promise we considered at one point. Endless Arrow, 3 of a Kind, Codex of Frailty. You can go up and down the list. Like, we thought about all of those options. But it ultimately came down to goals, came down to what we were trying to do to Lexi with our bans. And it just seemed like Bullseye Bracers got us to that sweet spot that we really wanted to be. And one thing I regret about the announcement I put out is that I don't think we were clear enough about our intentions with regards to Azalea. Azalea is a very, very scary deck, like extremely scary. And in that Ban and Suspended article, we sort of mentioned how we felt like her matchups had gotten better with the rotation of Ultim out of the format. But we still phrased it like we thought Azalea was a bit of an afterthought, like she didn't really matter in the process. It was all about Lexi. That's not true. Like, very much Bullseye Bracers being taken away from Azalea is intentional, because both of those decks could have been forces going to this metagame. And we're happy to have them be top tier decks. They just needed to come down a little bit to the field. That's all. And Bullseye Bracers did that to both of those decks.
That's a great shout. It's good to know. And then the other question I want to ask Brian is unbannings. I had an interesting conversation with James at Singapore where he alluded to the fact that maybe you do think about unbannings quite highly when it comes to, you know, these kind of situations. Could it be time to unban cards? Is that something we might see in the future? You know, might we see a card like Plunder Run return?
100%. Everything's on the table. We explore all these things all the time. And, you know, we mentioned in the bit about Bloodseized Scaletta. We tried so hard to get that card back into the format. I love Scaletta. Absolutely love it. One of my favorite Flesh and Blood cards of all time. And there were many, many times where we put in hours to try and see, is this the moment where we can return this card to the metagame? Is this how we're supposed to prey on Ultim? Is this how, you know, the metagame evens out by the presence of this, despite it being an absurdly powerful card? And the math just never checked out. And I will tell you that we will continue to evaluate all those options on the banned and suspended list and see what can come back. You know, there's only a few that I am suspicious if they'll ever make their way back to the CC game. Awakening comes to mind. Like, that card is just fairly silly. I think Skeletta's probably never coming back at this point into CC, but you know, even then, I don't never say never. Things can change, and we'll always revisit that portion of the metagame.
The Quest of Vast Beyond. So that card, it's effectively a Scalata, but does affect attack actions. Was there any consideration to maybe make that hit non-attack actions as well? And if so, could you have possibly made it, limited to a one of in a deck, so you could recreate the Scalata experience, but decrease the sort of, actually increase the variance drastically with making the player draw it, or suffer the opportunity cost of putting that in the arsenal for long periods of time in order to get off the combo? Because it looks like when I see this card, it gives me the feeling of Scalata. I'm like, oh, it's almost Scalata. It's almost there. Did you think about that at all with this kind of card?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course we did. It's just like, it's kind of facially there. X is a dangerous value to have on cards.
Yes,
and when you start combining that with Rune Chant, like, we just know you can put 30 Rune Chants into play. That is something that is entirely attainable. And as long as that is true, we can't hand you 30 resources. Like, it doesn't matter if we only do it once per game. That is a level of output that I don't think the game can actually bear all that well. And, like, that's not to say it completely shatters the game and a good game will never be played again if that option is available, but it's going to be determinative of the vast majority of games it's involved in. And that's the biggest problem with that effect.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about Dusk Till Dawn design, and I want to start with the macro design. And we touched on it a little bit, but this deep 4-hero design, opposed to what we've seen in the past with supplemental sets like Everfast and Dynasty, which have a little bit for everybody. Is this a sort of an experimental supplemental set for Legend Story? And do you see it as a risky one as well, being a set that potentially players could look at and be like, okay, I could skip out on this one, right? You know, my specific hero isn't serviced in a deep enough way where I feel like I need to buy this product. Is that considered at all when you switch the sort of fundamental design that you have in Dusk Till Dawn as opposed to what you've done in the past?
Yeah, first, I think every product we do is an experimental product. And if it wasn't, what we do would be boring. Like, we should always be looking for new things to do, ways to push the boundaries, ways to better serve players. Like, all of that stuff should always be on the table. And if we're just trotting out a formula every time, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, that's not what I signed up for. That's not interesting to me. And that goes as a designer or a player. Like, it's just not fun to have kind of like figured out the code and just plug things in. That's not what we're about. We're going to look to push boundaries. We're going to look to do different stuff all the time. And I think I just want that to become more clear. And it's something I emphasize over and over and over, because I do understand expectation of a supplementary set. A lot of people were like, oh, I'm going to get something new for my hero, and this didn't deliver on that. And I think the only thing that like we really did wrong there is maybe not emphasizing that you shouldn't have expectations going into a Flesh and Blood set. But I'm telling you now, get rid of your expectations. Anything can happen when we come to the table. That's supplemental sets, that's draftable sets. We're always looking at new stuff to do. As far as letting a product kind of pass by a player where it doesn't have something for them, I think that's okay. Like, you shouldn't have to buy everything we put out. That's not what we're here for. We're not here to drain your wallet. We're here to make game pieces that you are excited to play with and want to play with. And, you know, the fact that there is such a desire to see heroes get new tools just shows that we're succeeding in terms of like engendering passion for these heroes and making people love their classes, where, you know, folks like us, we go, oh, awesome new tools for Levi. We're going to have to check that out. Bolton got some stuff. We're definitely going to build that deck. Let's see how, you know, these new heroes are working. But some people just want more stuff for their hero. Like, they're not interested in all of those things. And that's fine. We'll get to them. And, you know, I could see on their point maybe being a little disappointed that not every set has something for them. But when you kind of narrow your lane, that's what you're signing up for. Not every set is going to have something that serves you, be it supplemental or anything else. So I hope that those people are, you know, they have enough love for their heroes that they're willing to kind of go through those lean times. And we've seen it. Like, look at the Leviah and Azalea players who now in back-to-back sets have just been completely served and are able to, you know, put forth their heroes with good faith, where for actual years, they were just jokes. They were laughing stocks. And well, it'll always come back around, and I just ask players for patience if that's the path they want to take. But I support that entirely. You don't have to buy every product. That's fine.
I don't know if the Kano set is coming for all the people that were crossing their fingers on that one. I'll say anecdotally, Brian, I think players, or me and Hayden have discussed, I think we like this set design more. It's more exciting. It's a lot more deep. I think the biggest question comes to sustainability and profitability for the company versus a different set. But ultimately, to serve the player, I would just say anecdotally to you, Hayden and I both enjoy this kind of design a lot more because it feels like there's a lot more to explore, right? Things go a lot deeper rather than, you know, I picked up Miraging Metamorph, which is just probably the best attack action in my Illusionist deck. I want to... Sorry, I kind of lost myself there for a sec, but I just had a sort of more questions around the macro design of D to D. What about the credence to, I know you've responded to this on Twitter, by the way, the players say this was a previously draftable set. I mean, it does look draftable, right? You understand potentially why they would insinuate that, or why they feel like that. It feels like it's so close, maybe not in terms of balance, but at least in terms of, you know, the split of cards. There's 4 heroes, etc. Was Dusk Till Dawn ever a potentially draftable set?
Nope. Wasn't even considered. It just wasn't. Like, I'm not gonna. I hope you guys realize, like, I'm not here to lie to anyone. I am very forthright. I think I, you know, sometimes espouse both popular and unpopular opinions, but I always try to be honest and true to myself. It was never intended to be a draftable set. That was not on the radar. What it was intended to be was a set that was able to serve a bunch of different desires from players. And look, Flesh and Blood is doing very well right now. It's growing fast, and it's growing in areas that maybe folks like us don't necessarily directly engage with. I do now because it's my job, but previously I would not have. It's growing in casual spaces, and it's doing so well. It's doing it with UPF. It's doing it with Commoner, it's doing it with Cube, it's doing it with just kitchen table play. Like, it's finding ways to succeed, which is actually what the game needed for that kind of long-term success. It doesn't need to just serve the competitive base as hard as possible. It needs to find ways into these more casual spaces. And DTD reflects that. It's designed to have commoner cards. It's designed to have cube experiences. It's designed to have ultra flavorful cards. It's designed to have UPF cards. All those cards are supposed to be there. And I think what you are seeing now is us shifting towards making sure we serve absolutely everyone with our sets. But at the same time, like, we're competitive gamers. You guys know me. That's what I'm here for. That's what James is here for. And we're never going to forget about like making exciting stuff to put forth in a tournament. It's just about finding ways to also serve these other players on top of it.
Yeah, I think me and Brendan, despite being competitive content creators, despite being competitive players, we've been pretty outspoken, I think, on the pod about saying how important kitchen table is to the future of Flesh and Blood.
It's everything. It's everything.
And I think we probably haven't given enough shout outs to you and the design team and all of LSS for what you've done with adding more of these cards for all levels of players, all players who want to explore this game in different ways. So just want to take this time to shout that as well, Brendan, because Brendan, we've both talked about this so much, and I think this is finally, we're seeing some of these cards. So,
yeah, I mean, the competitive player base, like, although it's we live in a loud echo chamber, it is an echo chamber. Like, we're a very small portion of the community. But all right, let's get into the micro design. Shout out Levia Redeemed. I mean, this is probably the coolest new design to happen to Flesh and Blood in a long time. This transitioning into a demi hero kind of feels like, I don't know if you've played Grand Archive at all, but kind of feels like the leveling up mechanic there is like, where did this design come from? And if it's balanced, if it's successful, is it something that we could potentially see is like our heroes, our Flesh and Blood heroes, they, in a game, right, via your inventory, they meet X criteria and they transition into Y with Z payoff. Is this something that we could see in the future of Flesh and Blood more? And where do you see sort of this Shadow Demi hero right now, like this Levia Redeemed and Blasphemous Levia consumed?
Yeah, if we do a mechanic once, there's always potential we could do it again. Now, that doesn't mean like we want to run out and make sure everyone has their Demi hero ready to go. The reason this exists is because it told a really freaking cool story. Like, that's basically where this came from. Its genesis was in another concept, which I'm not going to talk about, but may have been actually more wild than what this card actually ended up being. It was a real shot at something interesting that didn't work, but we refined that to the point where we did get to this Levia Redeemed, Blasphemous Consumed demi hero, and it just told this awesome story. It was so fitting for Levia. It was a hero that could bear some power creep, because this is power creep, and it's almost pure sense. Like, we didn't give you an additional, deck building slot. That's the only thing that prevents it from being pure power creep, but it very much is in power creep territory, and that's going to happen in our game. It's something that we're cautious about, but not allergic to. Levia was a really good home for some power creep without question, and the concept was just amazing. And this is the card that we worked hardest on in this entire set, and it was a challenging card. We spent so many hours making this card work to where it's just like, holy crap, this is telling an amazing story. All these abilities are exactly right. It's almost hard now to envision it any other way, but it went through so many iterations to get to this point. And I agree, it's the most exciting card in DTD. It just opens up so much possibility. But the thing that will always stand out to me is just how well it tells Levia's story, and is so unique to her journey as a hero. So
prior to the printing of Dusk Till Dawn, what was holding Levia back competitively? What were the actual limitations of that deck? Was it quantitative?
Rolling once.
It's rolling once? Okay.
That's it. I mean, like, if you, even before DTD, if you were like the hottest hand in the West and could roll some solid numbers, you were going to have a very good win rate. The problem is, every now and then you're going to roll a 1, and the hero just kind of folds in that spot. And I will say, I think Levia in the New World didn't solve that problem, but she's probably even better when she's not rolling ones. And that's the thing that means you're now getting to these ranges where the only thing holding her back is herself. Whereas previously it was herself and the metagame. And now I think she's just fighting against herself. And if you find ways to mitigate your variance, choose your variance spots carefully, understand when it's correct to expose yourself to those type of things. This is a very, very real and very scary hero now.
Yeah, I was going to follow up and ask is like, do you think that Brute is shackled towards this reliance on rolling dice and, specifically with the equipment for the extra action points? Or do you think that the future of Brute maybe lies in not doing that, playing cards like Hooves of the Shadow Police, or playing things like Dread Screamer, just, lower variance, but maybe a more streamlined power level? Like, is that the future of Brute, or are we going to, also still be doing these sort of higher variance things and we keep a lower power level on the Delta?
Yeah, I think both paths should be open, and I think both paths will continue to expand over time as long as they make thematic sense. Like, Brute should never have just thoughtful, calculating, perfect, no variance game plans. There should always be an element of risk reward, and it needs to continue to be a part of their kit, but it will certainly move all around the spectrum. And just as the card pool grows larger too, like there's more and more powerful Brute cards that don't necessarily expose you to those type of things. You look at Hayden's preview card, which is just an incredible defensive tool for Brutes, like maybe one of the best defensive tools in the game, honestly. And as we expand the card pool, it's just going to be more and more of that stuff. And it does so in a way that is very real to Brute. It is still random and has the chance to completely devastate your opponent's hand. Or maybe, you took the card they were planning on arsenaling out of their hand and you actually did nothing. So it's got those ebbs and flows still. I think it's a really good example of ways that we can stay true to Brute, but sort of just give them some more default powerful tools.
Can I ask a bit of a selfish question? I wanted to ask about my preview card. Glad you brought it up. Great segue. Scowling Fleshbag. Such an awesome card. I'm so grateful that I got to preview that card. I have a question about that someone asked me and I said, great question. So I'll pass the question on. Intimidate as a defensive mechanic, or a mechanic that can be used on the defensive side. Is this something that had been thought about before? Is this the first time it had kind of been explored? Is it something that we might see again in the future?
So this was the first time that I was working on a Brute-centric set. There were Brute cards certainly in Dynasty, but it wasn't really focused that way. So I can't say if this is a mechanic that has come up before. But when it came up as part of this set design, it seemed like a slam dunk to me. I just think it's a really, really cool idea. I don't know if the whole Brute identity is supposed to be built around it, but in terms of a legendary, man, that feels very legendary to me. That's one of the things I really like for legendaries to do, is sort of play on tropes and expand them a little bit and find new ways to use them. And you can see them with the Bolton chest in this set as well, with the ability to get some defensive charging going on. A very, very difficult thing to do, but there's a large payoff for it as well. And I like finding new ways to just kind of leverage existing mechanics when you get to the legendary space.
Talk to me about the design of the new Prism. How did you guys go about designing a balanced version of Prism with the sort of troublesome cards still existing, right? Maybe the weapon is gone, but you still do have those auras with Spectra existing in the format. What was sort of the ideology behind the current Prism design in Dusk Till Dawn?
There was a lot that goes in. I could talk for probably days. I mean, I did talk for days about designing this Prism and getting it to a place where it ultimately ended up. One of the pretty clear goals for this Prism, though, was that we wanted to make sure that her ability set was in no way additive to that kind of Spectra plan. So you can do that plan. You can build a deck that looks a lot like old Prism. I think that's still very, very you haven't lost anything except Luminaris, but you can still get your Iris, you can put together your auras. That is still a deck you can do. But we're not giving you any help to do it, and you're going to do it at a lower life total, because that deck, I mean, look, young Prism was showing up to events and doing okay. That should tell you that there is something there. And if you want to go down this aura route, you're going to have to do it on your own. Do I think it's going to happen at some points in the metagame? Yeah, I do. I do think it's still a viable strategy. But we wanted to make sure that it was something that Prism was kind of doing on its own. We didn't want the hero to be about that, and that was one of the guideposts for making this version.
Mm-hmm. How dangerous do you think this Prism's ability with the figments and the theoretical, or let's just say the possibility of being able to tutor your deck consistently? A very cool mechanic, by the way, being able to interact with your deck that much, be searching through it that much. How fragile is that mechanic? Do you fear any sort of future, I don't know, future design with that? Do you think it's a mechanic that can be a bit too powerful?
I think this Prism is an extremely powerful hero. I had a Twitter post today from someone. They tagged myself and James in their Twitter post, and then they basically yelled at us for 3 tweets about how dare we make Prism such a worthless hero with so little life, and they're thinking about quitting the game because we obviously don't care about Light Illusionists. And I didn't respond, but I had some thoughts, and I look, if you could figure out this hero in a week, then you're pretty big brained. I'll say that. It is a challenging puzzle to put together. Her ability is inherently extremely strong. Ridiculously strong, I would say. And she's not getting blank cards. She's getting real freaking cards off the back of already powerful heralds. Like some Herald of Erudition is one of the most powerful cards in the game. Again, like all these things come with hurdles, but the payoff on those hurdles is just freaking massive. It's so huge. And I think if you've written off Prism, you're making a mistake. That's all I'm going to say.
Is the future of Illusionist design a move away from Spectra and Auras and towards Angel-centric design?
I don't want to say that we never do Spectra again, but we all know the baggage that like Spectra brings with it. And there's a lot like I'm not even from a gameplay perspective. I think Spectra games could be quite interesting in a lot of instances, but they were warping and they are not at all intuitive under the rules. Like asking a new player to engage with Spectra is just so bad. And that is my biggest fault of the mechanic. It's not really a gameplay thing. I think OG Prism made for some great games of Flesh and Blood, and they were very interesting. But they were not intuitive, and that's my biggest gripe with Spectra. And it's not something we can really solve. Like it just is what it is. That is how Spectra is supposed to work. That's how it's balanced. That's what it's designed to do. And we're kind of saddled a little bit with that design. Again, never say never. I do have a lot of fondness for the Spectra mechanic. It could be we go back to it, but this was not the time to go back to it. We needed to do something different with this iteration of Prism and show what else Light Illusionists could do. Mm-hmm.
Talk to me a little bit about the sort of reinvigoration of Bolton, right? Some people say that it got the Ranger treatment. And I think that, you talk about power creep, something that you don't try to do, but you're not allergic to. And I think that Bolton is an example of that. We have seen cards, previously the sort of, the mechanic behind Bolton was charge a card, lose a card effect. Maybe use it in the future to get go again or some sort of ability, off of beacon or something like that. But now you can charge a card and get a bonus on top of that, a token or something. Is this a version of trying to bring Bolton up to par with the metagame? Because Bolton is a hero that, let's be real, it has historically struggled.
Yeah, so it's really interesting, sort of the nature of these Monarch heroes. And, when we commit to doing this idea, Dusk Till Dawn, we know what the heroes we're working with are. We're going to make a new Shadow Runeblade. We're going to make a new Light Illusionist, and we're going to fill in the gaps for Leviah and Bolton. But Leviah and Bolton are two of the most dangerous heroes, I think, in all of Flesh and Blood. Like, their core kits are so strong. And with Bolton, it's particularly about 3 cards. It's about Lumina Ascension, it's about Spirit of Arena, and it's about Beacon. And those 3 cards in concert with each other have some of the highest output in all of Flesh and Blood. Like, just the highest ceiling you can actually get to is some of the Lumina Ascension stuff. And, if you've played against good Bolton players, and there aren't too many because the incentives aren't there. If you're a great Bolton player, you get to like the point where you have a decent deck, not even a great deck. You're a phenomenal player. You've mastered everything inside and out. And now you've gotten to the point where you have a decent deck. But when you play against them, they make that deck feel real, scary, and just very challenging to play against at all points. So the space with which we could expand Bolton while those 3 cards are making up the backbone of his kit, it was tight. And there were points in development where absolutely Bolton would have been the best hero in the entire game had we put it out in the state it was in, without question. Mm-hmm. And getting to a place where it wasn't just ripping the metagame open and completely redoing things. That's not the treatment we're trying to give every time we reinvigorate these heroes. We knew we did that with Lexi, but it's not going to be what we do every time a hero gets pushed a little bit. Sometimes we want to take a C tier hero and move it up to a B tier hero. Sometimes a B tier hero needs to get to an A tier, and then sometimes we'll do the C to A thing. But in this case, the goals were to make Bolton viable, give some life to some more mid-range Raiden-ish strategies, very much open those up, but not just rip the doors off and make every game you play for the next 6 months be about Lumina Ascension and did I get just completely blown out of the water.
Yeah, I mean, my follow-up question was, is a more consistent Lumina combo something that you want or something you want to avoid? Even if it's about a small percent, was it something that you feel like you wanted to add in Dusk Till Dawn, or did you want to avoid that because it was already powerful enough, potentially?
Yeah, it's not so much that I think it needed to be wholesale avoided. We just had to be very careful with it. And I don't think we wanted to make it the best deck in the entire game. I'll say that.
Yeah, but, and I think that's healthy. That's a good choice.
But we do want to empower Bolton players. We want them to not feel like they're making a mistake when they register the deck. And I think we got to that place. That's going to be up to Bolton players and the metagame to decide. But I would expect to see more Boltons in the coming month. And granted, that's a very low bar. There was not a lot of Bolton presently. But if it was akin to Katsu pre-outsiders and Katsu post-outsiders, that would be exactly the type of glow up I would look for Bolton, where it's just, falling at the middle of the metagame. Maybe a really talented group of players works on it for a pro tour, and it turns out that that's the deck they want to roll with. All those things seem within the range of possibilities for Bolton now.
What are your metrics for a viable deck? What power level are you trying to bring heroes up to? Do you want these decks to all be sort of registerable at a tier 4 event without making a mistake? What is the bar you're trying to bring heroes up to?
Yeah, it's really hard to quantify. I can't give you any hard metrics to say. I don't. If you just ask for a really simple definition of where I would like heroes to be, I don't want people to be self-sabotaging every time they head out the door. Now, that doesn't mean you have to make the optimal choice, right? Mm-hmm. You can make a suboptimal choice, but where you're just actually impeding your ability to enjoy the game with your deck choice, I think that's a real problem, and that's something we have to avoid for heroes in our game. And I think Bolton and Levia both were very much teetering in that range, and I hope we've succeeded at getting them out of that range.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about Vincent. Are you trying to give players any semblance of chain with the design of Vincent?
Not really. I think Vincent is a different look at what Shadow Runeblade could do. I think there's elements of chain. I think in particular, Seeds being a real card again is interesting. That's compelling to me, and it calls back to the OG Shadow Runeblade. But I didn't feel with Vincent that there was a lot of pressure to mirror the chain experience. I think it was supposed to offer something new, but still have those vibes. It's all about vibes with classes. It just has to feel like you're doing Shadow Runeblade-ish type stuff. Mm-hmm. And I think Vincent's a real winner as far as that goes. Yeah,
I think you're correct. I think when you get down to the kitchen table level, which is, we've all agreed is the level at which this game will succeed. If you ask somebody what quantifies or what defines a Shadow Runeblade, they're not going to say, drawing three extra cards, or drawing 4 extra cards, or banishing my deck, right? Maybe banishing, but it's not when you sort of maybe go to a different level, it is just that, I want to invoke, with me, it's I want to evoke the experience of drawing more cards than I should, because that is exactly what Shadow Runeblade means to me. But it doesn't actually sort of, it doesn't bring out the class. That is not a Shadow Runeblade thing to do. It is just a chain thing to do at some point. What sort of play patterns do you really have in mind for Vincent? Where do you think Vincent will operate in the metagame?
I'm not going to answer that one. I was very happy to talk about the other heroes. I think Vincent is more of an enigma, and I don't want to steal any of the joy of figuring that one out. She's weird, man. She's a weird hero, and I think she's very different from Chain and maybe any other hero in Flesh and Blood. She operates on a strange axis, and at the same time, just like if I told you we're going to make a hero that lets you just play all of your powerful spells without paying their resource costs, you would be like, well, have you ever played a TCG before? Are you an idiot? Like, why would you do that? You're going to have to figure out why we did that and why we felt comfortable doing that.
People might start with eloquence tokens.
Yeah.
What was that?
Go ahead.
All right. I have a question I want to ask then that's about design relation to Vincent. It's something I noticed immediately when I saw Vincent for the first time. So Vincent has this, it's mandatory, right? It's not optional, this effect to banish at the start of turn. I wanted to know, is that a design philosophy that might, help players sort of thematically, sort of align with Vincent? Is it a balance thing? Is it a piece that is around kind of navigating and signposting for players? Or is it kind of all of the above?
All the above. Yeah, I think it does all those things. And it's also like very core to the thematic, just like sort of self-destruction, giving yourself over to shadow vibes that were really critical for this hero to embody. And yeah, I expect that it's going to be a challenging hurdle for people to understand how to play with, but it certainly points you in a direction. It tells you like, here's your goal. And the play pattern, when you get down to it, it's pretty clear, right? Like you want to get rid of your RuneGate stuff, banish it, get benefit from it, and then get these free spells. And I think it's critical that you do leave signposts for your players to follow. You leave breadcrumbs, but the nuts and bolts of it, that's something that's going to have to be figured out. And Vincent has a lot of nuts and bolts, that's for sure.
A great challenge.
I want to talk about the design of Flesh and Blood moving forward. Do you think that in the future of Flesh and Blood, is it possible do you design cards more focused around fun or more focused around balance and competitive viability? Because I think in Magic, it's called Fire, their version of design. I don't know if it was, first started in Throne of Eldraine, but, where they do emphasize this fun aspect of cards, maybe leading to a less balanced game overall. What is sort of the future and direction of Flesh and Blood? Because it's hard to evaluate Dusk Till Dawn because it just came out. But looking at some of the heroes that have existed in Flesh and Blood's past, things like Chain, OG Prism, Starvo, it feels like we've moved away from that sort of design. It's design that is very asymmetric, one-sided, Chain drawing drastically more cards than its opposing deck, Prism locking its opposing deck out of action points, and Starvo effectively winning the game in deck building. What is like the future design space of Flesh and Blood?
So I love that you mentioned Fire design because it is such like a hot talking point in the Magic community, and a lot of people sort of pinpoint it as the moment that things went downhill for Magic. It's very silly though, because all this was like an internal moniker. And if you spent any time in corporate environments, like that's just how this shit goes. You make up some moniker, you use that to focus people on your goal for a little while. And do I think they sat down and were like, well, everything's Fire design now and we have to change everything, and so we're never going to make a card? No, it was just like something they were talking about and something they were using to focus their thought process. And it's not to blame for the downfall of Magic. Corporate greed is to blame for the downfall of Magic. Like that's very, very clear to me. So I think worrying too much about are we entering a Fire state of design is, first, it's not happening. Second, it's just kind of smoke and mirrors and not a real thing anyway. But to that point, I do think we're thinking about fun more than we ever have before. And I think it's something that is coming to mind in terms of, making opening packs more fun, making playing games more fun, making limited environments more fun. All of these things, that's what this is. This is a game. You're supposed to enjoy yourself. And it's one of the things that, really burnt me out on my relationship with Magic was that there was no fun in it anymore for me. And when I realized that, that's when I was like, okay, this is something I need to separate myself from. And I don't ever want Flesh and Blood players to go through that. That being said, some will. It's just the nature of life. We grow, we change as people. Some people will opt out of Flesh and Blood, and I'm sad for it, but I do know it's going to happen. But I don't want it to be something that's they just get bogged down by the angst of it all. Like I just want there to be those moments of joy present, and that is very much informing design. And it all comes back to like what it's been since I started with LSS, is just like thinking about players all the time. Like, what are players going to enjoy? What's going to be their reaction to this? Is this something that they're going to appreciate? And more than fun, I think it just continues to be more and more player focused. And, you know, the definition of player is expanding, as we talked about. It means more players than ever before, but it's not subtractive, it's additive. And we can make cards for both of those players, those player groups at the same time. I'm confident in that. There's no reason to abandon one for the other. And I think, again, when we talk back to like Magic Shift, they really did abandon one group for the other and chose to focus on only one aspect of playing the game. That's not something we ever want to do. It's about serving all of our players at the same time.
Is a non-rotating format as a primary format, and you know, right now pretty much a singular format, is that a burden to design? Does it limit design in a meaningful way, and in a negative way?
I wouldn't say it's a burden. It's definitely a different set of restrictions that you have to operate under. But I think a positive set of restrictions. You have to think very carefully about things like power creep and, you know, what you're doing in combination with every card that has ever existed. That is certainly a large burden. But because we do have this kind of siloed nature of our game, where it is very hero-centric, it's a little easier than it would be in a game, you know, like Magic, where there is just infinite crossover and you can combine any two cards that exist should you want to. We have more rails than that. So I am confident that we'll be able to continue designing in this non-rotating space for a very, very long time. We have good systems in place. We know how it works, and it works for our game.
Yeah, speaking of those rails and hero-centric design, are you happy with the current Living Legend system? And how would you, like, what sort of advice would you give to players that maybe feel sort of left out or punished when their hero is Living Legend, to pretty much by no means of their own, right? Via a competitive circuit or, you know, competitive formats, you know, things that exist very far away from them. Their cards that, you know, maybe they've specified a specific hero. They are an illusionist, you know, it's just been reprinted. But let's say it was the old Shadow Runeblade chain, you know, their cards effectively leave playability for a long period of time, and maybe they feel a bit disenfranchised by the game. What are your thoughts on the current Living Legend system and how it potentially affects casual players?
I think how it affects the CC environment is good. I think it is very much working right now. We're in like the fully realized stage of Living Legend now. We have our first returning class to the game, and that's always the plan. There's always going to be, you know, a plan to bring these heroes back. There'll be another Elemental Guardian someday. We all know that. It's not going to be a forever thing. But in that interim period where those classes don't exist in the primary format, that's really about just offering players more ways to play and, you know, letting those cards have value. And that goes back to just like the goals of what we're trying to do. It goes back to making cards for cubes. It goes back to making cards for build your own limited formats. It goes back to starting to get pieces for the Living Legend format in place, which we are very much moving towards now as we get more and more Living Legend heroes. So I think we just need to provide more space for those players to still use those cards, and then it's completely fine. Like, we all appreciate a break every now and then. And look, I know some Prism players left the game after she hit Living Legend. I hope they're coming back now. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. That's something we're going to have to see as we go through this realization of Living Legend. But we'll keep building out gameplay systems to try and give those players other avenues to explore. And, you know, I think in terms of the impact on CC, though, I'm really happy with the way the Living Legend system has played out.
Yeah, I think it has played out very well so far. It has made some of the most beneficial and most impactful changes to the CC format, at least in recent history. What are your thoughts on the current changes to Blitz? And do you have any concerns that Blitz is sort of a micro format of CC now, potentially can cannibalize that format? Because, you know, the big differentiator between Blitz was no sideboard, right? And you had this Hearthstone-esque format. You did have equipment, and that was a version of that. But now adding in the ability to actually sideboard specific cards in, do you think that Blitz maybe just becomes quick micro CC, or is it still a distinctive and sort of its own format?
I think it is very distinctive. There's a lot of heroes which are only available in Blitz. There will be more heroes which are only available in Blitz as time goes on. To me, the biggest hallmark of the format was not the sideboarding decisions, it was the lower life total and really getting to that compressed endgame state much, much earlier. And, you know, some of us love the endgame state of Flesh and Blood. Some of us love the mid-game state. Like, I think it's totally fine that it just sort of appeals to different players. And the main thing is keeping it a pick up and play experience. And all of the changes that we're trying out here in this experimental skirmish season 7, they're all extremely, extremely focused on keeping that pick up and play, keep it simple, go copy a deck list and just submit all the cards and you'll be totally fine nature of Blitz as it was. And that is, again, a reason why we did not instill a cap when we came to deck sizes. We just wanted you to be able to just have all your cards and play them. So you don't have to make sideboard decisions if you don't want to. You can just have, you know, a 40 card deck with 11 equipment or 12 equipment now, if that's what you want, or you can have 44 cards that you submit in every single matchup and you have your 8 cards beyond that. Like, those are all options that you're allowed to do. And if you're looking for something with a little bit more customizability and a little bit more gameplay focused, if you are a Spike who's looking to win an event, that path is open to you as well. That's the goal with those changes.
You talked about, you know, the sort of the bar that we want to bring every hero up to is to make it so players are not actively sabotaging themselves when they bring that hero to an event. Do you think in current Flesh and Blood, if someone brings Riptide to an event, are they sabotaging themselves? Maybe the same question would go for Arachne.
I think no with Riptide. I think Riptide is a very powerful hero that plays a very linear, specific gameplay style and would need some very specific matchups to succeed. But if Riptide gets those matchups, pretty real hero. And I think that is actually doubly true in Blitz, where his ability is taking off a much greater percentage of your starting life total. Riptide's a threat in Blitz as far as I'm concerned. I think a very real hero. Arachne has... I don't think you're sabotaging if you're playing Arachne, but you should be playing Azuri. Like, that's really what it comes down to, is that she's a better assassin right now. That will not always be true. There are very much plans for Arachne. Arachne is not going to be completely left behind. We know everything in Flesh and Blood is about ebbs and flows. At some point, Arachne is going to have options not available to Azuri, which should give, again, a really good home for Arachne. I think the biggest problem with Arachne is that where the things that assassins punish, Arachne can still very much punish. So it's not a strict mistake to bring Arachne to a certain event. It's just that Azuri probably punishes them a little bit harder. And that's the biggest problem with the class right now.
Last question for me. What are your thoughts on the removal of Blitz from the World Championships format? Is Blitz no longer required as sort of that checklist that you need to check off to be the best player in the world, to be the most well-rounded player in the world? What changed?
I think for this year, it was just about this skirmish season 7 experiment and not having enough time to act on that experiment. And it kind of put us in a really hard spot where if this is really successful, and initial response has been overwhelmingly positive, we'll see how it goes when these games are played. But if this is really successful, and then we end up with a format at Worlds that people are into, then awesome, we nailed it. If this is an absolute disaster and everyone hates it and we force you to play it before we have gotten this information, that could be really bad. If we say that we just say we're going to offer Blitz as it was pre-skirmish season 7 at Worlds, and then everyone loves skirmish season 7 and we have to revert to the old format, that's going to be really bad. It was just kind of a mess given what we wanted to do. But at the same time, it wasn't something where we wanted to shelve our goals for the Blitz format and shelve this exploration of the Blitz format till after Worlds. It was something that we really wanted to do now and, you know, really explore, really see if we could find ways to just improve Blitz that little bit to really get the more competitive side more interested in it. So I don't think Blitz is gone from Worlds forever. It's certainly not gone from competitive play. It's just in this instance, it wasn't a good fit given everything we had going on. And it's a bit of a shame because I do think Blitz is an important part of the Worlds format, but it just wasn't meant to be this year. And there's always next year.
But Blitz is, I mean, my favorite calling I've played or high level event I've played so far was the team blitz calling. Two my favorite things, teams and blitz. But I think the way I'm looking at it for Worlds is last year for Worlds, we had a format that was a little bit more stagnant. We've been living with Uprising for a while. We're going to have a fresher limited format. We're going to have a fresher classic constructor format. So there's still a lot of challenges for players. Last year blitz was a challenge for players. Maybe CC was a little bit more solved. Maybe the draft format, you'd gotten all your reps in for Leal and you could take that with you, but you had to spend time on blitz format. I mean, we got to the end of the day and blitz really did make or break that top 8 in the end that got to Worlds.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And I'll tell you right now, y'all have your work cut out for you when it comes to Worlds. You'll be working with some new stuff, and you better be ready to prepare. And I think you'll be thankful that Blitz is off the table.
Yeah, imagine bubbling out to Blitz. No, I'm kidding. Sorry.
Thank you, Brendan.
You're
Thank you. Yeah, cheers. I have one more question on the philosophy side to add on to Brendan's, which is I want to ask a question about consistency, because it's something that sits in my mind so often with Flesh and Blood is the role of consistency in this game. And a lot of the most powerful strategies we've seen in Classic Constructed have revolved around consistency. Is that something that you want to see less of in Flesh and Blood in design?
It's hard to say. I think it has its place. I think consistent strategies will always have their place. At the same time, I think they should basically stay as is, but I sort of want to see the inconsistent strategies come up to meet them. And what that means is that we're probably going to have to live with a little bit more of those variance games, things like Lafire rolled all 6s this game, and Bolton found all the pieces of the combo early on. Like, those things are an important part of the process. There needs to be a little bit more variability in our game, I think. There needs to be some new faces coming to the top. Not to say I don't love all of our present champions, but, you really want to make room for that underdog story. I think that's an important part of every TCG. Yeah. And it's not about making consistency less of a thing in Flesh and Blood. You should always have that option. Just sometimes it should fall short when faced with the ceiling of these inconsistent decks that have just this absurd power output in their best form.
Yeah. Well, looking at the current, the results of tournaments and just the competitive scene of Flesh and Blood, do you think that it is prohibitive? Because we do see very, very familiar faces in the top 8 every single time. Is the current state of Flesh and Blood a bit too consistent? Do you think it's prohibitive to new aspiring players?
I think it is slightly too consistent. Yes, I do. And I think that is something that, it's going to be a process for all of us. We have to be comfortable designing into those spaces to add a little bit more variance. We as players have to be accepting of a little bit more variance, and it's I feel it. It's strange. In the period where I was sort of 1 foot in, 1 foot out of Magic, and I was playing mostly Flesh and Blood, I would occasionally go back and play a game of Magic, and my brain would just melt. Like something I had lived with for 30 years, legitimately 30 years of gameplay that I had just accepted, internalized, totally found as a valid point of the game system, and I still do, but I just wasn't as good at dealing with the flute, the flood, the screw. Like, it just hit me very, very differently when I returned to Magic. So we've gotten very used to playing a game absent those elements. And I do think, I'm not trying to say we need mana, screw, and flood. That's not what I'm talking about. But there do need to be points of variance in our game. You should always be participating in the game. You should always be playing the game. The outcome should always be something you feel you have influence over. But there do need to be those moments of variance that have influence over games.
Cool. Thank you. Great answer.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. Well, Brian, thank you so much for coming on. I genuinely think that Legend Story got very lucky with you. You are a fantastic voice and spokesperson for the game. And we really appreciate you coming on, our podcast for the second time to dive so deep into what really makes this game tick and what the future might be. So I just want to
I feel like this is like my 4th time. Haven't I been on this cast like so many times at this point?
It's like
I think you've been on the channel. You've been on the channel a few times. Yeah, I think it's the second time on the podcast, but I've roped you in for a few things.
Okay, maybe that's what I'm thinking of. Maybe I'm just conflating.
I'm being sabotaged over here.
That's awesome.
Yeah, but we really appreciate you coming on. I genuinely think that, like, for a game like Flesh and Blood, to have someone like you who is so vocal, who is so passionate, I know we've seen that in, sort of the genesis of this game. Like, James was very much that person, very much out in the limelight, sort of being that sort of bastion for the game. And I think you've taken a part of that mantle, and it's really, really important. And we got a lot of great info today.
Yeah, I will tell you that, James wants to still very much do that. He's just the busiest person on the face of the earth. Yeah. And I am happy to take some of that load off his shoulders. I can't replace him. He is the grandfather of this game. His passion inspires me, right? It's like where I come from, where I am able to throw myself into this to that extent because I trust him and I saw what he brought to the table. And the only reason he's not here on Arsenal Pass instead of me is that the guy just doesn't have enough hours in the day to be able to do all the things that are asked of him. But I am very happy that I'm able to speak for his game, and he gave me a great foundation to play with. It honestly feels easy to me. Like, you get set up for success when you're dealing with a robust game like Flesh and Blood, and more importantly, a company like LSS that is actually focused on like just making a great game and serving players. Like, that's all I ever wanted from a TCG, and they try that every single day without fail. So it makes my job very easy.
Awesome. Hayden, anything you want to close with?
No, thanks for coming on, Brian. It's always a pleasure. I was going to say, if you do want to follow Brian on Twitter, there's some good tweets from.
Just stop following me. I think I need to fuck off into the sun and just go away from social media. It's for my own health.
Just use this episode.
You can follow us instead.
Yeah, use this episode as a confirmation that if you tag Brian with negative feedback, he will read it, internalize it, and then bring it up later on somebody's podcast. Yes. So that is a way to get at him.
I read everything, bro. Like, I don't think people understand this. I read the purple Discord. I read your Discord. I read 10 other Discords. I read everything that's posted on Twitter. And it's not because I am sick in the head. I mean, I am, but it is more because I feel like that's such a critical part of my job. Like, I need to understand what people are saying. If I'm not listening to what players are saying, then I'm just failing. And sometimes the psychic damage from doing so is intense, but I am willing to bear it. And I read it all, and then I passive aggressively bring it up on future podcasts.
Awesome. Well, on Twitter, it's at Bryan Go. Hayden is at Finn_Dale, Matt Brennan APG. If you've been listening to the podcast for a while, if you like this episode, the number one thing you can do for us is leave us a review at ratethispodcast.com/Arsenal Pass, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. You can check out the Arsenal Pass Patreon as we start to wind up for national season, and then of course Worlds in Barcelona. Gonna have deck techs and deck guides going up there, and the support helps us keep doing what we're doing. Thank you all so much for listening. We'll see you next week.